All right, it looks like hopefully all attendees have been able to migrate from the waiting room into our webinar. So thank you again to everyone who joined us today for today's webinar on expanding access to broadband and digital opportunity in opportunity zones. My name is Catherine Lyons. I'm the Director of Policy at the Economic Innovation Group, and I am pleased to be co-hosting this webinar with Rachel Riley of ACES and Archers. Extra pleased to have our guest speakers with us today. Mike Landis from the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade, Ramona Malahi from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Jonathan Tower of Arcturus Impact Investors. So I will turn it over to Rachel to walk us through the agenda for today's webinar.
Thanks so much, Catherine. So today, first of all, Catherine, I'm going to switch it back over to Catherine in a minute to give us some Opportunity Zones updates and resources as we typically do on these webinars. And really, we'll dive right into the meat of this. It's about expanding access to broadband and digital opportunity. As Catherine mentioned, we have some experts on the webinar that can talk to this from, both a state perspective at the state government, from a federal perspective at federal government, as well as an opportunity fund or an investor perspective to let us know what they've been working on both, in two different states, in Colorado and in Maine. So we're going to provide some additional context and background around the need. And then we're also going to dive into those use cases. So really excited that everyone can join. And from here, I'll turn it back over to Catherine.
Thanks, Rachel. Before I dive into the updates and resources, I do want to note just a couple of housekeeping items up front as well. We are recording this webinar. We will share this recording and a blog recap, recapping this conversation shortly afterward to all registrants of the webinar. So if you would like to see the slides again or kind of revisit any of the topics we'll be discussing today, that will be made available to you on our website and sent to you over email. Additionally, we welcome your questions throughout the presentation, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. That will make it easier for us to ensure we try not to miss any. If we do, or if we run out of time at the end, we'll do our best to try to circle back either within our blog recap or individually with any questions you may have. But we will moderate Q&A at the end of at the end of all presentations. So in terms of new updates and resources on opportunity zones, I did want to ensure that everyone saw the EIG Opportunity Zone State of the Marketplace report that we launched last week ahead of the Brookings Institution's kind of all-day event about the early evidence around opportunity zones. This paper is just a really, hopefully, valuable resource to everyone on this webinar. That is a compilation of kind of what makes this incentive unique, where we find ourselves 3 years into the market, where we've seen some successes early on, and also where we see some potential areas for improvement, both legislatively, from a regulatory perspective, and just generally with the overall implementation of the policy. So highly recommend you check this out. It's a really great opportunity to learn a bit more about both how we got here and where we see the future. It also features some case studies, including the state of Colorado, in terms of what we've seen local communities do really well in the implementation of this. Our EIG runs an Opportunity Zones Coalition. So one of the most recent updates with regards to our activities within that group was responding to the Federal Reserve's proposed notice of rulemaking around the Community Reinvestment Act. We would love to see Opportunity Zones better interface with CRA. And be kind of noted as an eligible, eligible investments in certain cases, given some of the kind of core alignments between the two programs and their ultimate goals to help revitalize distressed communities. So I've linked there our response that we submitted earlier, or actually last month at this point. From a federal update, I think we got a couple of questions prior to this webinar related to what is happening at the federal level, both legislatively and in the administration on opportunity zones. we're tracking all this very closely, but at the kind of Treasury level or White House level, not a whole lot has come out just yet, other than what we've already discussed on prior webinars related to the Build Back Better plan and sort of some general thoughts around how opportunity zones could be improved. But one thing I did want to note is that a bipartisan piece of legislation from Representatives Burchett and Quellar introduced the Opportunity Zones Extension Act of 2021. This is essentially just a straight extension of the 2026 sort of gain realization date to 2028. So it's very simple, straightforward. This has been talked about by many policymakers, including Senator Scott, who's one of the champions of the original champions of the policy, just to make up for the time that it took for regulations to get into place and for, you know, kind of the full group of stakeholders to really enter the market with clear rules of the road. So that is recent legislation that was also introduced last month. One thing that I don't have on here, but I think we're continuing to get just really increasing levels of inquiries related to this, is the 2020 census update. So as every 10 years, of course, the United States conducts a census, and that changes the boundaries of what census tracts looks like, and it changes the map based on what they find. So that process is currently undergoing or is underway. And those changes are starting to be made to certain tracts across the country. What is unclear still is whether or not, as those census tract changes may affect opportunity zones, as they are census tracts, of course, whether or not those kind of changing boundaries also mean that, or how they apply to the incentive. If for example, a census tract expands, does a project that now starts in the expanded area of the census tract, would that be eligible for opportunity zones benefits? We don't know the answer to that yet. Treasury has not released guidance related to that. So I think there's a lot of kind of confusion around it, some misinformation that's starting to come through. So I think I just wanted to reiterate the fact that we are still waiting for guidance on this, from the agencies who govern the incentive. And that nothing should be taken as solidified until we hear from those agencies on this. So I think with that is probably that's the end of my update. So I'll turn it back over to Rachel to take us through the rest of the agenda and introduce our speakers.
Thanks again, Catherine. So just to introduce myself really quickly, Rachel Riley, used to work with EIG, but now I've founded a strategic advisory and consulting firm called Aces and Archers. And really what we are is we're a constellation of experts that are working with clients who are passionate about reimagining traditional models of economic growth and private investing in order to expand access to capital and address socioeconomic inequality. So I'm really excited to partner with EIG on these Opportunity Zones webinars. They're meant to really be a forum to elevate best practices, serve as a platform to address frequently asked questions, and also facilitate information sharing and dissemination as the marketplace continues to emerge. And as I mentioned, one of the questions that we get asked most frequently is, can I use OZ financing to expand broadband in my community? Obviously, we've seen the dark side of the digital divide. Although it's been present for quite some time, it's really been elevated into a national dialogue due to the pandemic, and of course, due to the ever increasing nature of our digital world. And so I think it's easy, or anecdotally, we can say that low-income communities probably have less access to broadband. But we have found that on average, 27% of Opportunity Zones residents live in a home without access to a computer and broadband internet. 27%. That is a large amount of residents that are disconnected from educational and economic opportunity. And I think that that's why folks are asking this question so much. How can we use this public policy tool to address this? Different studies have shown that socioeconomic status is one of the major causes of the digital divide, but is also a consequence of the digital divide. So it really is this unvirtuous cycle where those who grow up in low-income communities and in distressed neighborhoods, lacking access to the internet, are more likely to be disconnected from digital opportunity as adults. And so really when you boil down to it, the digital divide is an issue of equity. And I'm probably not saying anything new for folks that are on this webinar, because it's probably why you were attracted to join us in the first place. We're seeing, and it's been noted, that the digital divide impacts educational attainment even before the pandemic. It's going to impact job readiness and access to job opportunities. So, can you go online and search for job opportunities? Can you apply online? It impacts communication, representation, and information sharing. So if you're not able to vote in an online poll because you don't have access to the internet, that is a piece of representation that is missing there. And also information sharing. It's hard for you to engage in community activities or community, I guess, engagement, especially during the pandemic, if you don't have access to the internet. And then there's also this fourth pillar, which I think may be easily overlooked, but it's ease of life. So can you pay your bills online? Can you order groceries online? Can you check the bus route? I mean, it just becomes like a cascading effect of things that you're disenfranchised from when you don't have access to the internet and you don't have a computer in your home. And the Pew Charitable Trust has done a lot of really great work on this and has a lot of great resources on advancing digital opportunity. And I really think this quote, this recent quote, sums it up. It says, "When it comes to closing the gaps, the easy stuff has been done. And really, it's the hard work that remains." And there's a 2017 report from the FCC that found that it would cost $40 billion to get fiber optic cable, so the cable that carries broadband signals, to 98% of the businesses and households that currently lack access. And to get to the other 2%, it would cost another $40 billion. So we really are dealing with a steep last mile challenge in these communities. Next slide. So how do you even get at it? I think tackling the digital divide is going to require efforts on all fronts. It's going to require efforts and initiatives from the federal government, from state government, and also the private sector. So here you can see we have some policies and initiatives, recent policy initiatives from federal and state government. We're really excited to see that the Consolidated Appropriations Act that was passed in December included $7 billion in COVID-19 relief to fund broadband initiatives and provisions. That includes emergency broadband benefits for low-income Americans, dedicated tribal broadband connectivity grant programs, also to connect minority communities as well. And it also officially established the Office of Minority Broadband Initiatives, which has a specific mandate to focus on priority communities, including opportunity zones. In addition to the initiatives and policies that were just passed, of course, we have existing programs through USDA and HUD, which we're going to hear a little bit more about today. And then we're also seeing that states are using their CARES Act resources to target the same sort of activities. So really focusing on increasing access to online learning, supporting telehealth services, and deploying public Wi-Fi access, and ensuring that households are connected as well. There are different ways to go about this, and we're seeing states do this in a number of different mechanisms. So whether it's financing, so tax incentives, bonds, grants, loans, guarantees, we're also seeing interagency coordination and public-private partnership. Alignment with public infrastructure projects. We'll hear a little bit about all of these at some point during the webinar. And also focusing on community readiness. So ensuring that the community is ready to embrace broadband and leverage it to expand digital opportunity. Next slide. So I also wanted to share a little bit about what we're seeing with the private sector, especially as it relates to opportunity zones. Wanted to flag this great organization called Century Tech. Some of the folks on the phone may already be working with them, but it's a new social venture that's focused on digital advancement. It's focused on broadband deployment. They also have a really great shop within Century Tech that is focused on research and development, as well as program design. So ensuring that the community is engaged and ready to expand their digital opportunity once they do receive broadband access. Also wanted to flag the digital city in Memphis. We had Andre Folks on from StartCo probably back in September talking about opportunity zone investments into operating businesses. We linked that where it says leveraging OZ financing in case folks want to watch that webinar again. It's also on the EIG website. But the project that is leveraging OZ financing is called The Walk. And really it is the effort, it's the anchor project through which this new digital city in Memphis is being created. And it's combining smart city technology with an ecosystem that supports entrepreneurship. And really, this effort is to help accelerate investment after decades of divestment within Memphis. And it's a very cool initiative. Folks are interested in digital cities. I think DigiCity, which is also linked there, is a great resource as well. And then next slide. And the last thing I will share is on that webinar where we had Andre, we also had Jay from the Center on Rural Innovation, which is another opportunity zone. I would say stakeholder. Center on Rural Innovation has launched its Corey Fund, so an OZ fund. But really what Center on Rural Innovation does is much more broader than OZs. They have a rural initiative or innovation initiative. And that's really to create these innovation campuses within rural communities. And as they're looking for new places to go, they are looking at the presence of opportunity zones within those communities, as well as the presence of broadband. It is really important as communities are looking to attract new businesses, attract new residents, that broadband is present and high-speed internet is present, because that is a key part of their business strategy and their ability to reach customers. So wanted to share what Center on Rural Innovation is doing. And they also have this really great, I would say, icon or demonstration here around their thesis of digital economic development. So how you can stack these different ideas within place. So place-based digital economic development. One of their businesses that they've invested in is called Proximity Space. And EIG has done an investment profile on Proximity Space. I would encourage folks to go check it out. But just to demonstrate this idea of attracting businesses and residents to small communities based on access to internet, the founders of Proximity Space chose Montrose, Colorado, which is a relatively small town, due to a number of factors, but being able to have access to high-speed internet was chief among them. So it really does become this whole digital divide, digital advancement, digital equity becomes an issue of both ensuring that existing residents are connected to economic opportunity and education opportunities, as well as the ability to be able to attract new businesses and new residents to your community. And with that, I want to turn it over to Ramona from HUD, who I've been talking with probably for about 2 years. And she has really great information to share, as well as some news about some recent financing to expand broadband in Hawaii. So Ramona, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share the story of Hawaii. Next slide. So these numbers really are based on the 2019 American Community Survey before COVID. We do know that 55,000 households in Hawaii do not subscribe at that point in time to an internet subscription, and about 44,000 have no internet access at all. But when you drill down to the more demographic data, as you see here, what you'll see is that basically the impact on the digital divide is really focused on age, income, education, and race. Next slide. So let me give you a background on the Honolulu field office of HUD. First of all, as you all know, field offices really communicate HUD's priorities and policies in the local communities, and they also are the ones that help to build relationships in the communities. And field policy management, of which I am a part of, our focus is really on the implementation, executing of the HUD's mission in communities, and that's really on providing opportunities, especially for underserved communities. The Honolulu field office is the largest geographical area. We've got a lot of water, let's put it that way. But we serve the islands, we serve the state of Hawaii, territory of Guam, Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, and American Samoa. Next slide. So as Rachel mentioned, we do have what we call the Connect Home program. And the Connect Home program was started in a pilot back in 2015. And its basic thrust was on a public-private collaboration and taking a look at that three-legged stool of creating a national platform with technical assistance, bringing in stakeholders like carriers to provide free and low-cost services and resources, and working with the governments and leadership in the community and with public housing to be able to reshape and transform the lives of people living in public housing. Next slide. So one of the outcomes of that pilot, and it was a success, is what we call a playbook. And this playbook is really one of those soup to nuts playbook, helping you to learn how to get started, how to build partnerships, how to develop an action plan, and the biggest part, how to look for funding. Next slide. In 2017, HUD then, with its partner Everyone On, which is a nonprofit organization focused, national nonprofit organization focused on addressing the digital divide, spun off an expansion program. As you know, we're famous for acronyms. We call it CHUSA, Connect Home USA. And if you're to go to that www.connecthomeusa.org, you can have all the connections and all the resources that were available through the pilot, as well as the downloadable playbook. Next slide. So another tool that HUD has in regards to addressing broadband is really taking a look at where our funding programs are. And the two main ones in this space would be the Public Housing Operating and Capital Funds and Community Planning, CDBG, Community Development Block Grant Funds. Back in January 19th, all public housing directors were notified that they could use their current funds to be able to address the more infrastructure needs of their public housing residents. And for CDBG, Community Development Block Grant programs can be used for broadband, and particularly for providing public services like broadband in community centers or broadband in parks. Also, in terms of the CARES Fund Acts, there was a lot of built-in flexibility for these CARES Act funds. And so the CDBG CARES Act, CDBG CV can be utilized even to the point of being able to deliver devices, and as well as in public housing. Thank you. Next slide. So opportunity zones, there are 25 opportunity zones in the state of Hawaii. They're pretty much in our more urban areas, except in Kauai. So it'd be Hilo and Kona on the Big Island. It'd be in Molokai and Kahului and Wailuku, on Maui, Kaunakakai and Molokai, and on Oahu, all the way from Chinatown up to Kalailoa, and then Kauai to sort of rural type of visitor industry areas. Next slide. So for more information and fact sheets, you can go to the website, investhawaii.gov. The program is administered through the State of Hawaii Department of Business and Economic Development and Tourism, and you can find more information. Next slide. So what are the challenges on broadband that has really impacted Hawaii? Well, COVID-19 pandemic and the economy. For one thing, it has impacted and reshaped our economy. Hawaii's economy, as many of you know, we're one of the pretty faces in town. Tourism has been one of the largest single source of private capital. In 2019, it brought in 18 billion in terms of visitor spending, which translated to about 2 billion in state tax revenue. We were getting 249,000 visitors a day. We're supporting 216,000 jobs. We were taking 13.6 million airplane seats. That was our visitor industry pre-COVID. And as you can see, after COVID, our visitor arrivals have gone all the way down to 5,400 or 5,500 a day. Next slide. So that heavy wallop really hit our unemployment rate because 54% of the jobs lost were in the hospitality industry. So you can see that we have moved from an unemployment rate of 2.6 all the way to 9 as of last month in December. Our biggest chunk, of course, was 20% when COVID hit us. We are seeing a lot of job loss in terms of hospitality. We're looking at a job loss of 54% of 62,000 some odd jobs. And projections show that we'd be able to recover all the jobs by 2024. Next slide. So what has happened in the broadband space? There's two particular examples I want to just share with you. One is this broadband hui that was created out of the state. The broadband strategy officer for the state started bringing an informal group together back in March. And over the several months, it has built up a membership of 200 cross-sector members. I've been really impressed. Every known food group is attending this, from nonprofits, government, federal, all the way to city and county. Nonprofits are large, carriers are there, AT&T, a local Hawaiian tel company, Verizon, T-Mobile, people who are refurbishing computers, the Department of Education, the Department, and the great thing about it is it's created a forum. It created a strategy, a broadband strategy, and it also created what's we're calling the Digital Equity Declaration, which, by the way, has by resolution passed the City Council, both County Council of Hawaii, Maui, it's before Kauai, and it will be before the Oahu sometime in the next week or two, and it's before the legislature session. Next slide. Another initiative that's fresh off the press that I really want to also mention, as Rachel had talked about, is really part of the fomenting of interests, really allowed government and the state to be able to take a look at how much they were doing in this space. And one of the new efforts and initiatives is really coming in through our Hawaii State Department of Transportation. They are looking at delivering, as part of the backbone, Wi-Fi service to 8 underserved communities statewide. On every community rural on the neighbor islands, but on Oahu, they're kicking off and launching. The first community will be in Kalihi, which is in an opportunity zone, and the first Wi-Fi connection will be to about 2,300 public housing and senior housing units, some of them located in the opportunity zones. And we're excited about this opportunity, about being able to do the work that they need to do, as well as addressing the broadband and the digital divide. Next slide. So what are the takeaways that I want to share with you about what I've seen from the federal perspective in regards to what's happening in our community? One is that the broad engagement is critical, whether it's vertical across a sector, whether it's horizontal across all sectors. The importance of being able to entertain an ecosystem conversation. This is what's key, an ecosystem conversation, so you can be able to connect the dots, see the stakeholders, and set up those types of relationships are really important. So making connections and building relationships is really key. That comes from not working in silos, as we know, federal government does, we all do it in our own way. But really being able to work through those barriers and having those solid conversations that we need, and also understanding culture dynamics, whether it's the culture dynamics of the organization or the organizations or stakeholders that you're working in. That is really key. No one size fits all. Catalyzing new partnerships. One of the things that we have access is both Arcturus, who is the speaker today, but also Century Tech, who Rachel mentioned, taking a look at how these partners could bring their expertise to help catalyze those relationships and really help to tease down and drill down in regards to what's important and help us to think through some of these relationships. So we really develop pathways, whether it's career pathways, lifestyle pathways, training opportunities. So sharing resources, information, education, and platforms for advocacy are key, because keeping information within a group and not taking a look at how to make those connections outside of the group, outside of what we call the broadband hui, is really the opportunity to make those ecosystems change. And the last thing is leadership and locally based solutions. You know, we always talk about the promise of the opportunity zones. And this is one of the place-based tools in a whole toolkit of place-based tools. And one of the things that we should remember is that our communities require leadership from within for change to be effective and sustainable. And when solutions come from an engaged community, I can guarantee you that there is no limit to the good that can be done. Thank you.
No limit. That is right, Ramona. Thank you so much. Before bringing on Mike, I just want to share that, all three of our guest speakers today, Jonathan, Mike, and Ramona, have been in conversation with each other and collaboration with each other to share, what sort of barriers they're running up against, new ideas for solutions. And I think it really does speak to the opportunity zone ecosystem and the importance of information sharing when it comes to tackling these really big issues. So with that, I want to introduce Mike Landis from the Colorado Office of Economic Development and International Trade.
Hi, everybody. As Rachel said, my name is Mike Landis. I work for the state of Colorado in our Office of Economic Development, International Trade, and I am the state's Opportunity Zone Program and Special Projects Director. And it's actually nice that the second part of that title, Special Projects Director, is in there because it allows me to do kind of a closer examination on how I can shift the Opportunity Zone program to be operating in different facets of our state government. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a little bit about the Office of Economic Development. We are essentially focused on creating a positive business climate in Colorado. We're supportive of dynamic forms of economic development and sustainable job growth. And we have a variety of financial and technical programs in our offices. And that extends from the kind of creative industry side, film and television and media and outdoor recreation, to our rural opportunity office, our business funding and incentives, global business development, minority business office, small business development center. We touch really all of these different aspects of economic development, and we're housed under the category of the governor's office, the executive branch of Colorado. And our executive director is Betsy Markey, who's a former state representative from Colorado. Next slide. Okay. Why broadband? We've touched on this plenty already, and I don't want to belabor it so much, but coming from the perspective of the state and thinking about this, particularly in a time of COVID, I really want to hammer on the fact that access to healthcare is a huge element of the importance of broadband. There's telehealth, online portals, the digitization of data, the remote monitoring of patient care. All of these things happen through broadband networks. And like Rachel said, 27% of Opportunity Zone residents have limited or no access to broadband. 14% of Colorado, 85,000 households have slow or no access to broadband. And this really has a huge impact on economic opportunity. And the note here is that it is easier to find jobs and train for jobs, and it actually reduces the everyday strain of your life, really. And I'm really glad also that, Rachel, you brought up the technology company Proximity Space in Montrose, Colorado. They also operate in Grand Junction. And they operate in these small kind of mid-sized cities because of access to gigabit internet. And notably, crossing over into the Opportunity Zone space, this group, Proximity Space, managed to raise 20% of its fundraising goal because of the overlay of an OZ in Montrose. So we're seeing the interaction between broadband and Opportunity Zones there in sort of real time. And it's worth noting that the more we have opportunities like that, where there's an Opportunity Zone space that has access to high-speed internet, in Colorado, we have a huge land price problem. Land is expensive, especially in the Denver area. And anytime we can find parts of the state where it'll be more affordable for companies to move that require access to high-speed internet, we're able to shift some of the growing Colorado economy into areas that really need it. And I noted here also about social cohesion. Broadband helps develop and maintain social networks, and I think that we sort of take it for granted now. I thought about it in the context of my own life. I met my wife on OkCupid. I did it through my phone, and it's really one of these things where, it's just very basic things that have become such an ordinary part of our lives that we rely on it for more than simply healthcare and economic stuff. It's really the ease of our life. Next slide, please. So we have two major funding sources for broadband deployment here in Colorado that come from the state. And the first one is the Broadband Deployment Fund. And it's run out of the Department of Regulatory Agencies. And it essentially awards grants to private entities seeking to deploy broadband service in unreserved areas of the state. It's awarded, I think, almost $41 million since 2016. And they go through regular periods of grant processes. And I'm going to kind of come back to that a little bit later here, because we found some areas for exploration of how to use the OZ program in that process. But we also have the Department of Local Affairs Energy Impact Assistance Fund. And this is a fund that specifically is trying to serve as a connective tool between different jurisdictions that operate within existing networks. And it supports access to learning opportunities and telemedicine, and helps provide kind of the strategic planning portion and middle mile infrastructure with grants and funding that can help make those things a reality. And I'll also note that Colorado also has some crossover with the Office of Information Technology, which interfaces with the broadband networks. OIT largely works with electric co-ops, but what they've done is extended some of that conversation to kind of moving past simply providing telecommunications apparatus and infrastructure, and trying to kind of push those groups toward expanding what they're providing over to broadband networks as well. So next slide. And now, just to turn back to the Opportunity Zone program for a second. Like I said, the OZ program, we at the state level, we focus on a variety of different pillars, and a few of these really cross into the broadband space. So nomination of zones back in 2017, Colorado focused on creating large scale or focusing on larger census tracts in rural areas for the targets of our zones. About 65% of all of Colorado's Opportunity Zones are in rural areas. And in the western and southern and northern parts of the state, that can encompass huge amounts of ground, which is very valuable in the context of trying to build out a network. Because we have whole towns and municipalities that are encompassed by the opportunity zones, which makes it easier for a broadband network to want to extend itself and not have to kind of juggle the question of whether they're moving too far outside of the zone with their physical infrastructure. We do a lot of focus on education about the Opportunity Zone program and how it can operate, in particular, in this case, toward infrastructure investments. We support local communities by putting spotlights on them, trying to bring projects in local communities up in front of investors. And it's with these investors that we try to communicate with regularity in order to kind of be the connective tissue between the project space and the investor space, because it turns out having a state institution that's willing to do a little bit of legwork for the investor and to promote through marketing and spotlighting some of the local projects on the ground can be a very valuable thing. We have a grant program that provides technical assistance to communities that are seeking help in their strategic economic development plans. We have a capital accelerator program that helps businesses develop their fundraising plans, their pro formas, and then introduces them to investor groups. And more than anything, we really try to cultivate an investment ecosystem that can meet the needs of investors who want to get their rate of return while making those investments in projects that will have an impact on communities in a positive way. So that's how we're operating at the state level from the Opportunity Zone perspective. And in terms of broadband expansion in Colorado, so here's this question. We've got an incentive, the Opportunity Zone incentive, that is really focused on patient capital. It really rewards investors who want to leave their money in a single project for an extended period of time. And that seems to really jive well with something like infrastructure, because you're not about to be moving your broadband network after you lay it in the ground. And so are we seeing OZ investment in broadband in Colorado? In theory, this should be operating with regularity, and in practice, not so much. And there are a bunch of reasons for this. And the first is really the biggest problem we're always going to have with the OZ incentive, which is just ignorance of how it operates. It is a change to the tax code that really ultimately focuses its impact on the investor class. And what we've done, what we sort of recognized at the state level, is if we want this to work for local communities, what we need is just the entire ecosystem of investor to project to municipal manager to everyone who's involved in an Opportunity Zone space to know quite a bit about how this operates. And we've been working to try to approach all of these groups of individuals on a individual and also global basis of how to meet this challenge. But ignorance of the OZ incentive is a huge barrier at any time. There are structural challenges. Broadband needs a lot of space to operate, and that's its own challenge. But I think the bigger challenge, and this is something that I want to talk about for a minute, is that many states restrict broadband expansion. And to kind of focus on Colorado for a moment, Colorado in 2005 passed a bill that prevents the state's municipalities from creating their own broadband networks without a local vote to say that they're willing to do it. And this is a huge problem, because all of a sudden what we've done is we've created a barrier that sits in the way of broadband expansion, because what it requires at the municipal level is local support for the notion of exempting themselves from a sort of archaic piece of legislation. And I am certainly not trying to get on this call and start a fight with anyone, but I'll note that this legislation served as a launching point for state-based legislation around the country that restricts broadband expansion at the local level, largely at the behest of the largest broadband companies with the lobbying power to make it happen. There are currently 22 states that have legislative roadblocks to municipal broadband expansion, and states that don't have these restrictions have lower internet prices on average. So what we're seeing is what some people would describe as anti-competitive behavior that's been supported by legislation. And we can actually see a tangible effect between the states that have this legislation and those that don't. And it turns out that in Colorado, the Senate Bill 152, which was among the first of these bills, it's actually one of the least restrictive because at least we can have municipalities vote in order to exempt themselves from it. That's not available to a lot of other states. And it's also worth noting that some major broadband companies, when they know that a vote is coming up, and I'm looking at Longmont, Colorado, these larger companies will engage in indirect financing in campaign expenditures. They'll leverage their super PACs to try to campaign against those votes. So this is, I'm going into detail here just to explain just how difficult it can be to expand broadband because of the fact that there are legislative barriers here. And finally, I'll also just note that broadband providers are reluctant to share equity with other groups. Sometimes they like to retain control of their project and are even resistant to applying for state and federal grants. So next slide, please. How do we overcome these challenges? I've mentioned a little bit that ignorance of the OZ incentive, targeted education is really important. Topic and region focused educational webinars, of which many of the people on this call right now have participated. Outreach to the finance industry is something that we're going to be doing this spring, which is focusing a call directly to finance professionals on how to use the OZ incentive and providing technical assistance at the local level. Structural challenges in the meantime, I wrote here, create bigger OZs in rural areas. Obviously, no one at the state level can just create new OZs. However, we are anticipating major changes to opportunity zone legislation. It's not out of the question that this could include shifting some zones to different areas. It's something that states should be considering if they're thinking about restructuring their zone map. And I'll also note that it's worth looking into legislation that could ease the access of private money into partnerships with public entities. And this is about de-risking investments in low-income areas with lease guarantees and non-recourse financing. And finally, with regard to providers who are resistant to sharing equity, it's worth taking a look at the notion of partnering with the municipalities with which they need to participate. If municipalities are interested, they can create their own qualified opportunity funds, raise money, and then through a variety of different strategies that include buyout structures, find a way to raise the money to expand the projects locally. Last slide, please. I will not spend too much time on this because I don't want to steal Jonathan's thunder, but I am thrilled to see that Arcturus is working with the Colorado Health Foundation, as well as the Finance Authority in Maine. Shout out to Maine as well, that they've committed $60 million to investing in broadband infrastructure. And that'll expand broadband access to 25,000 households, which is extremely important. And that's my slides. I know that we're kind of running toward the end of all this, and I'm sorry if I've taken too much time. Rachel, forgive me. But please reach out to me if you've got questions about the perspective of the state when it comes to interacting OZs and broadband. I think that there is a lot to learn from failures that we've witnessed here in Colorado. These things don't always succeed. We're really at the outset of the opportunity zone process. We've got to learn from somewhere. And I think I would say from the perspective of Colorado, we are more than happy to talk about where we've met those barriers and stumbling blocks, just to see how we can get around them as well with the help of other people.
Thanks so much, Mike. I had a long intro for Jonathan prepared, but I'm going to let the work speak for itself. Jonathan?
Hey, thanks, Rachel. I'll try to hold up to that intro. Great to be with you here today. And this is an important conversation that I think has become more important because of the crisis that we've been living in over the past 12 months. If you're an economic developer, a mayor, a governor, an OZ investor, or a charitable foundation, you're going to learn in the next 10 or 15 minutes how to use the OZ tax incentive to accelerate broadband development in your communities. I'll give a quick background on Arcturus impact, but that's not what this panel is about. We're really going to focus today on specific strategies and partnership models that can benefit you and your communities. As background, Arcturus is an impact investment fund with experience over 11 years and 6 funds investing in low-income census tracts and low-income communities. Arcturus has raised 2 OZ funds, which are committing capital to broadband projects, which will bring internet connectivity to your lowest income and most challenging communities to connect. We're not going to be able to lay out the entire OZ broadband roadmap or the tax model in this conversation, and there are significant tax and strategic considerations that go into structuring these transactions on a statewide scale. So this is just an introduction. This is an introduction that's meant to pave the way to further conversation. Contact info is on the last page of this presentation, and if you are interested, I'd welcome anyone to reach out for a more detailed conversation. Just by way of background, Arcturus is an impact investment firm. Over 11 years, we've focused on three things. One is delivering above market returns to investors. Two is incorporating principal protection and risk mitigation into our funds, which comes through partnerships with foundations and state government agencies, cities and counties. And three is community impact, driving quality living wage, job growth, social and racial equity, and sustainability in underserved communities. Next. At a glance, we've been investing in underserved communities for 11 years. Opportunity zones were kind of a natural outgrowth of what we had done previously in partnerships with state governments and US Treasury Department. Frankly, OZs are a better tool than all the other tools that we had in the shed previously for addressing these types of systemic inequalities that our fund seeks to fill. And again, we are investing for above market returns to investors, but we can actually do that in a pretty modest way through the OZ incentive, and also because our principal protection partners, the government and agencies and foundations that participate in our fund, they do de-risk the fund. So our investors are typically not looking for venture capital style returns. We tend to aim for pretty steady, consistent returns across our funds. Next. Over 11 years, we've created these types of public-private partnership models where in each case, there's usually a 20% base that comes from government or foundations. And this is really the prototype that we started with the US Treasury Department back in 2013 and 14 with the Arcturus Michigan Fund. We did the same thing with Arcturus Impact and with both of our OZ funds. And in the case studies of the statewide broadband infrastructure projects that we'll be examining in the next several slides. So onward. I think we know what all the demographics were, and it's amazing to think that 12 months ago, I used to get in debates with people who'd say, well, I understand how affordable housing is a social determinant of health, but how do you apply that to broadband? How does broadband actually affect the social determinants? And I would actually have to make my case. I think the data's out there. Rachel gave a great overview. I think we know that this is critical not only for telehealth and work from home, but also school security and pretty much anything else that we try to do. It's also sustainable because it cuts down on a lot of freeway driving time if people can connect, just as we did here today. So next. Our solution is that Arcturus has launched a partnership-based program to fund broadband fiber projects and opportunity zones with emphasis on digital equity. This program is driven by partnerships with cities, counties, states, and foundations, plus the federal government. And what we're trying to do is deliver affordable high-speed internet access to underserved communities that aren't on the list to get it anytime soon. If these were the types of projects that Comcast Xfinity was trying to compete in, we wouldn't be needed. We're doing the projects, the programs, and the communities that just aren't on the list for typically one of two reasons. One is that the people who live there don't make much money and they're not able to pay a high enough monthly rate to attract the big incumbent providers. And the second is that in rural areas in particular, the cost to connect, one house to the next house down the road, which might be 3 miles down, it's a high cost per door-to-door connection. But we do believe that this is critical for the United States, and we understand why public policy has shifted significantly towards funding these underserved markets. These do create pathways to prosperity for employment, online education, and telehealth for low-income individuals. Next. I'll go in first on the case study for Colorado. And this is a public-private partnership with the Colorado Health Foundation. It's a $2 billion public health foundation. We connected with them through the Kresge Foundation, which is one of our anchor fund guarantors. And they presented us to us a problem, which was basically what I laid out to you there. In rural Colorado, initially, there were significant challenges delivering broadband access to low-income communities. With COVID, the program focus actually expanded, not just from rural communities, but also, say, Denver inner city urban core areas where affordable broadband access might not be available. The basic project is this: $50 million of equity investment from our OZ funds. Colorado Health Foundation provides a 20% anchor guarantee, and that's a principal protection guarantee. It doesn't guarantee that we won't lose money. We're still at risk, but it is $10 million of principal protection. And that comes through the form of a guarantee. It's a bankable guarantee, and it's one that we can use to help the project pencil out better. The estimated reach is 25,000 households and small businesses. Together with CHF, we developed it's essentially an algorithm or just a model for determining which communities are more qualified than others for receiving this. Again, we're not looking for the highest income communities that just happen to be in an opportunity zone. We're looking for the more challenging ones, while still respecting that this is a business that does need to turn a profit at the end of the day. Patient capital, but it does need to return profit. And with this, we're developing this impact and broadband screening criteria. We don't actually build anything ourselves. We do pay for it, we do own it, but we are partnering with a number of local firms in Colorado and other areas to do the construction work, the network architecture. And then we rent this network out to municipal government partners and also to ISPs who will use it for the final customer outreach. So we are really owning the infrastructure. And then at the end of 10 years, that's a saleable asset. We sell it. There's no long-term cap gain if it's an opportunity zone investment, as we know. And in all likelihood, it would be purchased by the communities that were using it over that period of time. But it is a fair sale at the end, and that Colorado Health Foundation guarantee stays with the investment over the life of the program until we realize a full exit. Next on to Maine. Maine is structured very similarly. Our initial salvo in Maine is a $10 million project. It's for two communities, South Portland, Maine, and also Belfast. $10 million OZ equity project. Finance Authority of Maine provides, again, a 20% anchor guarantee, plus a below market rate loan to help finance these projects. The reach is about 9,000 households and small businesses. These are denser populations than some of the ones that we're serving in Colorado. These are cities with 30,000 people and whatnot, as opposed to rural agricultural areas where you've got less density. And in these, again, we're partnering with local ISPs, partnering with local construction, and laying out the network. We own it for 10 years. We lease usage of the fiber, the pipes to our ISP and government partners. And the Finance Authority of Maine, which is backed by the full faith and credit of the state, is providing a guarantee, which gives us downside principal protection in the event that fiber is not worth as much or the project is not as successful as we had hoped. So these are two examples, and within them, there are a lot of variations. There's a lot of leveraging how this foundation works or how this government agency works. And now that we've got these two prototypes, we're actually working with a number of other mayors and governors and foundations to develop similar models in other cities. So we certainly have, I think, perfected the model on how to do this internally. And I'll just add that opportunity zone broadband is kind of like the perfect tax asset for opportunity zones. When you think about Opportunity Zone fiber, it probably has a useful life of 50 or more years. We don't know. I mean, it hasn't been around that long, but we think it's worth it. It's useful for at least 50 years. But on a tax depreciation basis, we are able to do bonus depreciation the year that it's put into service. So 50-year useful life, 1 year depreciation, those two match up much better than a building or something like that, which would be maybe useful for 50 years, but you're depreciating it over 39. So that the tax benefits on a project like that are actually significantly more attractive than what you might see in real estate. And we're using that. So next slide. So that's our contact info, and would love to, if this has stimulated any ideas on how you might be able to accelerate broadband connectivity in your own neighborhoods, in your own communities, in your own states, would love to have a further conversation about that. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Oh, sorry, Rachel, if you're going to chime in. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to all of our panelists today for your fantastic presentations, lessons learned, and really important case studies and new resources for attendees on this webinar. Unfortunately, we are a few minutes over our allotted time, so we will not have an opportunity to answer questions live or in real time that you all submitted, although we thank you very much for your engagement throughout the presentations. What we will do, and hopefully the panelists are all okay with this, is I'll share questions afterward with those that I think are directed toward the various panelists, and try to get answers as part of the recap blog that we will post in the next couple of weeks or so. That includes the recording and link to the slides for these presentations. So hopefully that will be able to answer some of the questions. Obviously, if you have more specific questions as well, as Jonathan said, our contact information is all right here. Feel free to reach out to any of us directly, in order to get your questions answered in a more expedient manner if needed. And I think with that, Rachel, any last words?
Nope. Thanks everyone for attending, and thanks to our great guest speakers. Appreciate it, everyone.